So we'll begin the webinar now. I'm Professor Denis Noble, the chair of this particular webinar on fasting, autophagy, and aging. Are women different? And we have two very relevant speakers. We have, first of all, Professor Abhinav Diwan from Washington, St. Louis, who carries many responsibilities in basic physiology as well as clinical practice. And we also have Stephanie Estima, who is going to join us for the second of the presentations today on this subject. So without any more ado, I'm going to ask Professor Abhinav Diwan to begin his presentation. Can you now take the screen and also unmute yourself so that you can do the speaking?
Yes. So thank you, Denis. I'm excited to be at this presentation and also delighted to be spending this time along with the other panelists. Stephanie, again, this is a tremendous opportunity to hear from you as well. And I'm looking forward to telling you a bit more about our understanding of fasting, autophagy, and aging, and highlight why women may be different through these slides that I'll present. My goal will be to make this a thought-provoking exercise where this stimulates discussion, and would love to hear questions from you along the biological and clinical themes. So these are my disclosures, and these are the various funding agencies that support our work, and these are my affiliations at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. So at the outset, I'm showing you data from the United States, as these maps that are color-coded visually present the fact that we have an epidemic of obesity and diabetes. The darker these colors get, the worse things are. In fact, more than 2/3 of the US population at this time is overweight or obese. This is leading to an epidemic of diabetes. And it is estimated that about 15% or 14 to 15% of US adults might be diabetic, and half of them do not even know about it. So this is a major issue. Also because there is an alarming recent increase in premature heart disease mortality. If you look at these curves across all ages over the years, we've done a tremendous job through prevention and through treatment of reducing mortality due to heart disease. But if you focus on the very end of this curve, now there is an uptick. And it is thought that the epidemic of diabetes and obesity is perhaps the reason that this is happening. If you see again in a color-coded map, the rates of cardiovascular disease are starting to mushroom again. And you will see the darker colors indicate a faster rise with higher rates. So again, this is spread out pretty much all across the US. Now, what do we know about the biology of aging as it predisposes to cardiometabolic risk? So it turns out aging causes changes that take us along the slippery slope of developing metabolic impairment. That happens with an increase in visceral fat as we get middle-aged. And there is excess free fatty acid delivery to the various tissues. There is decreased physical activity and hormonal declines. And this is even more relevant in the context of women when we come to that subsequently. What are the cellular drivers of aging dysfunction? It is thought that mitochondrial dysfunction, and again, mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. When they are impaired, they release their mitochondrial genome into the cytosol. That is known to stimulate inflammation and senescence. And shown at the bottom of this panel are drivers of inflammation and senescence that cause inflammation, which is inflammation as a driver of aging. So now let's try to understand what may be different about women. As it turns out, as is shown on the slide here, while sex is clearly a variable, it's anatomic, physiologic, as we know, genetic, because the chromosomal differences and sex hormones, gender, which has to do with psychological, social, cultural, and behavioral aspects, plays into that to overall alter the risk of disease for women. I have noted some references there that point to the fact that 1/3 of all deaths, 28% in the US, 35% in the rest of the world, of all deaths in women are due to cardiovascular disease. And even more alarmingly, 1/3 of all deaths during pregnancy, which is still an unfortunate event, are due to cardiovascular disease. So we need to pay attention to this. At the bottom, it shows you the life cycle of aging in a woman, where you see the early reproductive life, which is the period when the hormonal cycles are normally functioning, and the risk for cardiometabolic disease is typically low. I will show you some examples of cardiac disease that can still happen that may account for mortality during pregnancy. And then there is the perimenopause period, where again, hormonal changes are coming into effect with loss of ovarian follicles, decrease in estrogens, and decreased secretion of GnRH and FSH. And then there is a postmenopausal phase. And you see listed on the top are various adverse phenomena that then women face with, and their risk for cardiometabolic disease skyrockets to start matching the male disease, male risk prevalence soon after menopause. And it's loss of menstrual cycles, vasomotor symptoms, urogenital atrophy, mood and sleep disorders, osteoporosis, which is another important one, and perhaps effects on the brain and as well as reduced cognition as an increased risk for Alzheimer's disease. And shown on the next panel, here it is. So on the panel on the right, you see the various changes that happen with menopause: decreased physical activity, increased comorbidities, increased risk for depression. There is a decreased muscle mass, which sarcopenia is an important comorbidity with aging in women. Reduced energy expenditure, increased weight, increases the risk of diabetes. And again, I apologize for why the slides are malfunctioning, but there is a change in insulin action. So there is insulin resistance in the perimenopausal period, also a reduction in insulin secretion. So that is a double whammy that affects women. So on this next slide is laid out how heart failure, which is a very important morbidity that is emerging, and again, emerging at epidemic levels in both males and females, in our aging population, as well as with the diabetes and the obesity risk that we are seeing. And you see listed on the slide are how the biological differences and genetic determinants and risk exposure affect cardiac aging in women and vascular aging differentially versus men. And that manifests as an increased risk of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. So heart failure comes in two flavors. One is where there is a muscle problem, a squeezing problem. That's heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. There's an emerging realization about heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, where the muscle squeezes normally, but it's an filling issue. Turns out women are uniquely predisposed to this. And that is why we need to be paying attention to women's biology and specific pathophysiological events affecting them. Some of those are listed on this slide. And then this next schematic is going to lay out really why disease or heart disease in women is like the tip of the iceberg. It is what we see through obstructive atherosclerosis. Because when a woman presents with chest pain, which is often a sign of coronary artery disease, the chest pain is atypical. So as a cardiologist, I can tell you, we don't hear the exact same story from any two women, and their stories do not match what we hear from men. So we are attuned to looking for symptoms that are common in men, but very low prevalence in women. And their symptoms are not typical at all. And that is depicted in this iceberg shown here. And some of the acronyms you see, which is spontaneous coronary artery dissection, INOCA, which is ischemia with no obstructive coronary artery disease, MINOCA, which is myocardial infarction with no coronary artery disease, Turns out these are driven by coronary artery dissection in women during pregnancy, often leads to MI and deaths, coronary artery spasm, thrombosis, formation of lipid plaque and fibrous plaque, which is a classic obstructive coronary artery disease. So in women, we need to be focusing on this huge part of the iceberg that is below what meets the eye. And that's an important driver of cardiovascular disease. Then I also want to briefly talk about diabetic cardiomyopathy, because it turns out that diabetes is also affecting our heart muscle. And for folks who are interested, we can go back to these references and look at them carefully, but I'm going to go through them fast at this point and highlight that it is known that in diabetes, a 1% increase in hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker we use to determine control of diabetes or evaluate control of diabetes, 1% increase, 30% increased risk of heart failure. In type 2 diabetes, 1% increase in A1C is associated with 8% increased risk of heart failure. So really, we're bracing for an epidemic. So now let's get back to biology and try to understand what may be going on. So this is a slide from one of our reviews where we talk about myocardial metabolism in the physiologic state. Turns out the heart is an omnivore. It can eat all the different substrates that it sees from the bloodstream, which is a good thing. But under stress and in pathology, that metabolic flexibility is lost. Fasting is the only form of physiologic stress where that metabolic flexibility is maintained or even enhanced, which is why fasting may be good for cardiac metabolism, as compared with other syndromes listed here: ischemic syndromes, diabetes, cardiomyopathy, and aging. The metabolic changes you see there generally denote metabolic inflexibility. Now, the heart cannot use all the fuels and is limited to using some fuels, which induces dysfunction. And how does intermittent fasting benefit? So in this slide, we've postulated some of the benefits that are associated with intermittent fasting, and that may be by cycling of this mTOR kinase, which is mammalian target of rapamycin. Suffice to say that it is the master regulator of growth. So at times of plenty, when nutrients are plenty, mTOR is active, there is growth. During starvation or fasting, mTOR is inactive, autophagy is stimulated. So now we're starting to talk about autophagy, which is a mechanism whereby the cell eats parts of itself, autophagy, in order to rejuvenate and sustain itself, enhance survival, and get rid of damaged proteins and organelles. So that leads me to the question, why is my lab interested in lysosome biology? So it turns out the buck stops at the lysosome. And as you see listed here as the title of the slide, we think of the lysosome as the janitor, because lysosome is thought to be the incinerator that cleans up the cell. But it's really the undercover boss, because it's taking care of a variety of cellular functions that are listed here. The ones in green include autophagy, and as you will see, it pretty much touches every aspect of cellular physiology and metabolism. So the lysosome is like the stomach and the liver of the cell combined. It's the metabolic orchestrator of the cell. Now, shown in red are some adverse effects of what lysosome function can do, and excess autophagy has been implicated in that. So while we talk about harnessing the benefits of autophagy, we have to be cautious and keep in mind that there may be a downside which we have to actively look out for and design our therapies such that we obviate that and we focus on getting benefits. So I put up this slide to tell you that lysosomal storage disorders, which are genetic disorders, have been known now for decades as causing human disease. So these are inborn errors of metabolism due to genetic changes in individual lysosomal genes or proteins. What we've focused on are diseases of acquired lysosome dysfunction. And I've put up this schematic here from a review that focused on neurodegeneration to show you how genetic changes, aging, which is right in the middle, the most important risk factor, inhibits lysosome function. It turns out that impaired lysosome function is thought to predispose to neurodegeneration. What our work and others' work has shown that aging and impaired lysosome dysfunction predisposes to cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. And I'm going to put up an interesting parallel between the two up here. You see ApoE4 allele listed on the top. This is the single highest risk conferring allele for Alzheimer's disease. Turns out it also increases risk for cardiovascular disease. Listed at the bottom are traditional risk factors that we think about as risk factors for cardiovascular disease. But some may be surprised to know that these are also risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So in our work, we have postulated that these genetic and environmental risk factors combine with aging, the biologic phenomena that I showed you with aging, in order to cause acquired lysosome dysfunction, which is different from genetic lysosome dysfunction. And it impairs autophagy, because autophagy has to happen ultimately in the lysosome. And I'll show this on the next slide. What is autophagy? Autophagy is a process where the cell rounds up stuff to be degraded, which you see here labeled on the left as ubiquitinated proteins, damaged mitochondria. Autophagy is a process by which a double-membraned autophagosome forms across these. So it puts stuff in the garbage bag. Then this garbage bag has to be taken to the incinerator, which is where the autophagosome is shown as fusing with the lysosome to form an autolysosome. The lysosome then breaks down the stuff, and the basic building blocks are released through the lysosomal permeases. Turns out that this process of autophagy is also thought of as flux through autophagy. When you talk about stimulating autophagy, you want to increase flux through this pathway. But lysosome is where the buck stops. If the lysosome is impaired, autophagy is impaired, and those garbage bags accumulate, autophagosomes accumulate. And in work that we have done, we have shown that intermittent fasting stimulates this transcription factor, TFEB, which is a master regulator of autophagy and lysosome biogenesis. So on this slide, I've listed various diseases that our lab has focused on with the common theme of acquired lysosome dysfunction. And I'm going to show you snippets from a couple of those, but would welcome questions and can describe this in more detail. To begin with, I'm just going to summarize that we have uncovered beneficial effects of intermittent fasting on myocardial infarction, that it reduces infarct size. I'm going to show you that. In obesity and diabetes, by preserving beta cell mass. Beta cells are the cells that produce insulin, and they are typically lost with advanced diabetes, which is why we need to inject ourselves with insulin. Diabetic cardiomyopathy, which is we just talked about, and protein aggregate cardiomyopathy. Turns out, through our work and others, we're realizing that cardiomyopathy may also be a protein aggregate disease, just like neurodegeneration is. So lysosome function helps with that. So myocardial infarction happens when a coronary artery gets blocked suddenly, when an atherosclerotic plaque, shown here in yellow, ruptures and a clot forms. And in that setting, when you start having chest pain, you rush to the hospital. The goal is that as a cardiologist, we want to get into your coronary arteries and open them. Because the longer we wait, you see on the x-axis, the more minutes you wait, the more muscle you lose. So this is what you want to do. You want to get into the artery, open it. You want to stop this process. You want to save muscle. In reality, this is what happens. That reperfusion also induces injury. So myocardial infarction, despite our best contemporary care, we're not really salvaging myocardium. And here's an opportunity for us to stimulate autophagy in order to salvage myocardium. And we showed that. When you do intermittent fasting in mice, as you see here, are pictures where mouse hearts were infarcted, and then they were stained for a vital dye, where you see the light-colored part, that's the infarcted heart. In the right panel is a mouse that was fasted every other day for 6 weeks and then subjected to myocardial infarction. The quantification shows you that the infarct size was cut in half. And this benefit was lost in a mouse model of impaired lysosome function, which is the LAMP2 heterozygous null females I'm showing you. We also then studied diet-induced obesity. We made mice obese by feeding them a Western diet. In that setting, and pardon me for the multiple graphs here, I can summarize by saying that once we made mice obese, and then we started intermittently fasting them, you'll see on panel B that the mice lost weight. And then in panel D, you will see that their glucose tolerance became better, i.e., their diabetes became much easier to control. And this was because we could salvage beta cells. So you see here on the third panel from left, these are mice fed a high-fat diet, they're obese, and beta cells are red and alpha cells are green. It is the red cells in the pancreatic islets that produce insulin. Compare that with the leftmost panel. You've lost beta cells. But when we intermittently fast these mice, the beta cells come back. There is more red, there is more insulin. And we showed that this is because of beta cell regeneration. This was also work confirmed by Walter Longo's group, where they showed extensively that intermittent fasting stimulates beta cell regeneration. So now this is a really important issue that we need to think about, which is how does circadian biology affect intermittent fasting outcomes? This will be very relevant as we think about designing intermittent fasting regimens for benefits to humans. So first, let's think about what circadian biology is. So this cartoon simplifies how external inputs, as you see in panel A, light or darkness, signals to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain, which regulates our central clock. There is a whole panel of molecular regulators, transcription factors, which you can think of like wheels that are turning each other, that regulate each other, that get regulated by the light and dark cycles. And those inputs through neuronal signals and hormonal signals then controls the clock in all our tissues, the peripheral clock. Turns out that with fasting and exercise, we can modulate our peripheral clock. So the central clock is still reliant on light and dark cycles, but peripheral clock can be modulated by diet and exercise. This is a really important concept. And this goes to the fact that our fasting feeding cycles regulate autophagy. When we are sleeping at night, autophagy is turned on. When we're eating during the day, autophagy is turned off, okay? And you see here in panel C, the different times of the day. Turns out the physiology in mice is exactly opposite to humans. Mice are active at night, which is shown up here. But an important point here is, and this I heard from one of the leaders in the field, Sachin Panda, the conceptualization that before electricity came about, humans would eat only during daytime because then you could see things, you could hunt for them. So you were forced to fast at night. But now with electricity, as soon as we wake up, we turn on the light and we start eating. And then we don't stop eating until we go to bed. So the period over which we eat is extended and the period over which we physiologically fast is reduced. And that's the really important concept that we need to focus on. And that's what a group focused on in this paper in Science. And Sachin Panda wrote an editorial to that, and I'm showing you a schematic from there, which focuses on how meal times and calorie restriction affect longevity. The very top, you see ADLIB, where the red circle around the night and day tells you the mice were eating all the time. They had access to food. Kind of like us. We can wake up in the middle of the night, raid the refrigerator, and get something. You see below that calorie restriction, where the dotted orange line suggests that the mice were eating, they were forced to eat less. It's important for us to realize that sustained calorie restriction is very difficult. All clinical trials where calorie restriction has been implemented for weight loss has shown that as soon as the trial was stopped, the people who lost weight with calorie restriction gained it right back, because behaviorally sustained calorie restriction is almost impossible to continue. It's the really dedicated, disciplined folks who can do that. On the other hand, intermittent fasting has been practiced in many cultures for ages. which is another reason why intermittent fasting is an attractive strategy for humans. So going back to this schematic, I'm now going to take you to the third from the top, which is calorie restriction during the daytime, but you cannot eat at night. So that's calorie restriction with fasting. You see lifespan was prolonged 19%. Now, if you do calorie restriction and you eat only during the first part of the day, this is like eating a heavy dinner along with calorie restriction. You do get some lifespan prolonging effects. They are shown there 10% by 11%. Now look at the bottommost panel. Compare that with eating a heavy dinner. The bottommost panel shows you in a mouse that the mouse is allowed to eat ad lib in their version of the breakfast time. And the rest of the time they're fasting. So this is called time-restricted feeding. The other side of the coin is fasting. So time-restricted feeding in some ways is intermittent fasting aligned to the circadian cycle. And if you look at the bottom panel, that was where you got the biggest bang for the buck. Lifespan prolongation was the longest. So I'm going to skip this slide and talk about what about the clinical studies that examine benefits of intermittent fasting in cardiometabolic disease. And my partner, Stephanie, I believe, is going to touch on this much more. I'm just going to give you highlights of clinical studies that are out there. So there is this work from 2011. It was from the UK, where they showed in a trial with young women, young obese women, that intermittent calorie restriction, which is intermittent fasting, was equally efficacious as continuous calorie restriction on weight loss. So all participants achieved weight loss and their metabolic parameters got better. Shown on the right side is a study just published in Cell Metabolism. This was only in men, but I'm aware that this study is now being replicated in women. And they showed that time-restricted feeding improved insulin sensitivity, blood pressure, and oxidative stress. So it is having beneficial effects in humans on cardiometabolic risk factors. Interestingly, intermittent fasting also has immunologic benefits. There was a study that looked at how intermittent fasting might affect autoimmunity in the CNS, which is multiple sclerosis. Autoimmune diseases preferentially affect women. And it's really important in this context to understand how intermittent fasting might be affecting the biology. And in this study, they suggested that intermittent fasting works by altering the gut microbiome. This was a mouse model of multiple sclerosis. And since then, there have been multiple small clinical studies showing some benefit in patients with multiple sclerosis with intermittent fasting. Then this was another study that looked at, can you combine time-restricted feeding with exercise training in women who have obesity and diabetes? And in this randomized controlled trial, if you focus on the abstract, the graphical abstract, you will see that intermittent fasting and exercise both reduced adiposity. But the benefits in terms of hemoglobin A1C control, as well as VO2 max, which is oxygen consumption, which is a very important correlate of exercise capacity and longevity, was enhanced with exercise plus intermittent fasting. So this may be the ideal prescription. Time-restricted eating, perhaps focusing on a heavy breakfast. This paradigm needs to be shown in humans, by the way, so I'm not advocating it. I'm saying mouse studies would suggest eat a heavy breakfast and exercise during the day. And that likely is going to give you the maximum benefit. So let's now focus on what is known about studies reporting sex-based differences in response to fasting. So here was a study that evaluated the association of breakfast consumption frequency, so the same theme that we talked about, with fasting glucose and insulin sensitivity in, as you see, high-risk families with type 2 diabetes. And again, my computer, oh, here it is. Okay, so the gist of the findings here was that in both males and females, reduced breakfast frequency was associated with increased diabetes. As in, if you skip breakfast, you're more likely to have increased diabetes, but the mechanisms by which it happened were different. So again, this points to unique biology in humans. This was another study that examined the effect of alternate day fasting in postmenopausal versus premenopausal women. And that was the focus of the study. And they showed that postmenopausal women lost more weight with both alternate day fasting and sustained calorie restriction, but the metabolic benefits were similar. Subsequently, there were 3 other small studies that were analyzed together, and there really wasn't much difference between postmenopausal and premenopausal, suggesting that the benefits of intermittent fasting can accrue irrespective of the menopausal status. So that's an important message. So, okay, here we are. Then, what is known about changes in sex hormones and metabolic outcomes in response to fasting? So shown on top is effect of intermittent fasting on reproductive hormones in females and males. And they showed that in obese females, fasting, especially when the feeding time was restricted to breakfast and lunch, reduced testosterone levels with increased sex hormone binding globulins. This might have relevance in women where increased testosterone is thought to be a driver of pathology, such as polycystic ovarian disease. In males, testosterone was also reduced by intermittent fasting, but remarkably, it did not affect muscle mass. So it uncoupled the effect of testosterone on muscle. This becomes really important because a question that we anticipate is about sarcopenia. How does intermittent fasting affect muscle mass? And this finding would suggest that even though testosterone, one of the drivers of muscle mass, is reduced, muscle mass stays preserved. At the bottom was a study that examined sex differences in metabolic outcomes after sleeve gastrectomy, which is a surgical way to reduce body weight, and compared that with intermittent fasting. And I'm not sure why my computer acted up again. I am going to try this. So maybe I'll just show you here that it showed that and this was a study in mice, that female mice with diet-induced obesity had better metabolic outcomes than male mice with intermittent fasting as well as sleeve gastrectomy. So this study suggested that maybe female mice derive more benefit from intermittent fasting. So with that, I'm going to stop and take questions. And I really want to thank members of my lab. The ones in bold are the ones who are currently with us. And I want to thank my collaborators and funding agencies, and I'll be delighted to take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Abhinav. We're running a little bit over time, so I'm just going to do two quick questions and hope you can provide some quick answers. The first one, is the autophagy idea always beneficial, or are we giving it too much credit?
It's a great question. By and large, studies would say that autophagy under stress is a good thing, that it is enhancing cellular processes that allow the cell to survive, rejuvenate itself. But then there are clear areas where autophagy is detrimental. One such area is where the disease in question is causing loss of muscle mass, an excessive loss of muscle mass. For example, there is a form of cardiomyopathy associated with cardiotoxic drugs that are used in cancer chemotherapy. And some of these cancer chemotherapy drugs cause loss of cardiac muscle mass. And in studies that are yet not published from our collaborators, I'm aware that intermittent fasting was actually deleterious in that setting. So one has to be cautious of when to apply intermittent fasting, and that's why one cannot just give a generic prescription that everyone should intermittently fast. This has to be done on a one-on-one discussion with the patient, looking at their unique situation. But by and large, it is beneficial.
A very quick question. What diet is ideal for these?
Yeah, that's a great question. There, as you might be aware, many studies suggesting, Mediterranean diet, ketogenic diet. When a patient comes to talk to me about it, I tell them that you can find evidence that all of these diets work. Okay, but from a practical behavioral perspective, implement a diet that you can. For example, if you were born in one part of the world and someone tells you, no, you got to try a diet from this different part of the world because that's the only way you'll be healthy. Well, you might be able to do it for 2 months and then you'll say to hell with it. This is not what I grew up with. So it's important for that to be relevant to your individual scenario. And for that matter, I believe that all different cultures and diets can be adapted for benefit.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Diwan. We'll now move on to our second speaker. Dr. Stephanie Estima is a doctor of chiropractic with a very special interest in metabolism, body composition, functional neurology, and female physiology. And as the creator of her signature female-centric ketogenic protocol, the Estima diet, Dr. Stephanie has helped over 10,000 women worldwide regulate hormones, reduce adiposity, and get off medication. She's also the author of The Betty Body and host of the Better podcast with Dr. Stephanie. Well, here we are. Stephanie Estima, the floor is yours. You can unmute yourself and put your slides up.
All right, so this, I put the slide up a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course. Of course, we know that men are just not an on and off switch, but the image here is really here to demonstrate that women are far more complex in terms of our hormonal landscape, as Dr. Diwan was explaining, some of the different reactions in terms of interventions and cardiometabolic outcomes. I will say even the term woman is a little vague because as we move through different hormonal environments over the arc of our life, again, even the individual woman is going to be premenstrual. She's going to move through her reproductive years into her perimenopausal years, and then in through menopause, mean age being somewhere between 50 and 52 years. And then she's post menopausal. So we really want to be cognizant of some of the differences, not only between men and women, but the woman as she changes over the course of her life. So just a very quick little bit about me, 19 years in private practice, doctor of chiropractic, creator of the Estima certification and the Estima diet. So I'm now teaching doctors and practitioners female-centric protocols. Mom to 3 boys, so wanted to raise three sons who are very well versed in female anatomy and physiology, and their wives can thank me later. And of course, podcast host Better with Dr. Stephanie. So part of the reason I became interested in fasting and intermittent fasting was the application specifically to women. I had a lot of women coming to me for weight loss help, but almost immediately there was a pattern that emerged that was different for women and their male counterparts. And fasting is very, very much a sexy proposition because many women, when they are in their journey of weight loss, will often reach plateaus much faster than their male counterparts do. And it's much harder to break through those plateaus than our male counterparts. And as you mentioned before, I developed a female-centric ketogenic program, but before it was just for women, I would run this in the clinic, and a lot of men and women, husband and wife partners, let's say, would do the program together. And you would often have the husband being like, "Doc, this is just the greatest program ever. It's been a week. I've dropped 10 pounds. I feel great. My energy's through the roof." And then you'd sort of have the wife, trailing in, sort of, shuffling. And she's like, "I don't know, we've been eating the same thing and I've only lost maybe a pound." So very early on in sort of my journey into nutrition and longevity and health span, there was very much a difference in pattern in terms of outcome for men and women. Often, unfortunately, women, let's say with their allopathic physicians, the only thing that they're told if they are obese or they have any type of hormonal derangement is that it's all that matters is, eat less, move more, right? This calories in, calories out sort of thinking, which of course calories matter, but there's often not a consideration for some of the different hormonal presentations and how that affects a female's physiology versus a man. Of course, we know men are very circadian in nature, and they sort of have a bit more of a steady state, we'll say. So they're kind of the same, every single day, whereas a woman, and if we're going to get into some of the sexual dimorphisms between men and women, but of course, one of the more obvious ones clearly is for a woman in her menstrual years, she has a different sort of hormonal milieu every single week. Like, she's very different. So she's not, when I'm talking to patients, I'll often say, men are like the sun and women are like the moon, right? So men sort of operate on this beautiful circadian rhythm where we see very predictable rises and lowers in testosterone and estrogen, et cetera, whereas the female pattern is often extended out over the course of about 29 or so days. So about a lunar cycle, let's say. And I would say that it's very much changing. Of course, Dr. Diwan was really great at showing some of the recent research, but when I first got into fasting, it was not studied, I would say, scant at best. And research, of course, gives us information. There's such a dire need for well-done studies. And then we need the research, and we also need the clinical application of the research. So the research gives us the information, and then the clinician is going to apply the information in a real world setting. So in order for the research to sort of come to its full, actualization, let's say, we need the clinicians who are aware of the literature, first of all, which is maybe a problem onto itself, but then the clinician needs to have an understanding of female physiology and look at the patterns and being able to pivot for her patient or his patient for best results. And I'm so thrilled that we were talking about some of these cardiometabolic outcomes, because I think one of the most salient examples, and this was very true when I was in school, is the difference in presentation of a heart attack between a male and a female. And I think it was only after there was a certain tipping point of women being turned away at emergency that they maybe started putting things together, that the female presentation of, let's say, a myocardial infarct is distinct from, there's some overlap between men and women, but there are some distinguishing features. Like I was taught in school, a heart attack is sort of like intense left-sided pain with like stabbing or shooting pain going down the arm. And for a woman, that may or may not be the case. She might present with a very bad headache or indigestion. So this is it's important for the clinician, it's important for the doctor to be able to understand the literature and being able to apply the information. So just kind of building on that, just talking a little bit about cardiovascular disease, we do know, of course, there is a difference between men and women in terms of the onset for CVD. There is a phasic shift so women tend to get cardiovascular disease later on in life. And we think that there's a couple of reasons why we think that that's true. One maybe is through pregnancy and the placenta sort of conferring some type of benefit for the woman while she's pregnant. Of course, estrogen in her reproductive years, we know, has very direct effects on vasodilation and the health and integrity of the intima and the arteries. Of course, men evolved from sort of a teleologic perspective to heal from wounds quicker, but with cost. And women evolved to protect and produce offspring. So we have sort of lower baseline levels of inflammation than our male counterparts do. And then we have that, as I mentioned, that protective effect of estrogen when we are in our reproductive years. And just to kind of drive this point home, women with early menopause, so women who go into menopause before that mean age of, call it 50 to 52 years. It's like the mode is somewhere around 51 years of age for most women. If you are a woman who goes into menopause early, so if you are 40 years old or younger, they have a 2-year lower life expectancy compared with women with a normal, let's say, or even a late onset of menopause. And this is data from the Framingham Heart Study, which suggests that harmful cardiovascular risk profile may be more cause than corollary or consequence at age of menopause. So it is important to understand that we are even though we have most of the same parts, there is some difference in the expression of our physiology. And just for the nerds on the call, the other thing I just wanted to expand on here is that we actually have, in terms of cardiovascular disease specifically, it seems also between men and women that we actually have sexually dimorphic livers, and it turns out that mammals do have. There's differences in clotting factors. Of course, clotting factors are produced in the liver, and the big difference, or the big sort of difference between men and women here is, it seems, growth hormone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about growth hormone and fasting in just a moment. But when we talk about the let's say expression or release of growth hormone between men and women, we know that men have a more pulsatile release of growth hormone with longer intervals between those pulses, and women actually have more of a continuous release of growth hormone with shorter intervals between the release. And in rodents, you can actually inject growth hormone in a particular way that can completely reverse the gene expression in the liver to make, if it's a female, let's say, liver, to make the liver, that particular liver more masculine, or vice versa. So I just wanted to bring that up as like a point of interest, that yes, the reproductive cycle is going to be the distinguishing feature between men and women, but there are other areas that are different as well. So this is what I teach. I teach doctors and practitioners on female-specific physiology and clinical protocols because I'm a doctor, but I'm also a woman, so it's a point of interest for me. But I also think that even in this post-COVID, hopefully we can call it post-COVID era, I think that there's been not only an interest in weight loss, which certainly I think is still very important, but more of a deep yearning for like deep cellular health. Like, we want to be healthy from the level of the cell up. So if there are invading pathogens, whatever is to come, that we have the faculties to deal with it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits of fasting. Many of this Dr. Diwan has already covered. Autophagy, of course. I love the explanation that Dr. Diwan gave. I often, when I'm explaining to patients, I always say autophagy is like Pac-Man, right? It's like they're going after the little pellets, and then when you get all the pellets, you get to move to the next level. A couple of other things why fasting is an important strategy to consider when we're thinking about health span and longevity, of course, is the clearance of senescent or zombie cells. So these are like cells that are just kind of hanging around and causing local and then eventually systemic inflation. And of course, that systemic inflation is going that is going to activate, let's say, inflammatory pathways as a means to try and reduce some of that inflammation that's happening. It also augments longevity genes. So I know this could be obviously a conversation unto itself, but when we think about FOXO genes and HDAC inhibitors, like all these different mechanisms that we see actually in centenarians and supercentenarians, so individuals who are living 100 years and beyond 110, 115 years, we see this profound activation in these FOXO genes. And then, of course, the other thing that fasting does is it provides metabolic flexibility. So this is kind of a nebulous term in some ways, but basically, when we're thinking about metabolic flexibility, it means your ability to use alternate substrate. So we're bringing so typically, the molecule of life is glucose, right? Glucose is used in every single cell in the body, but we also want to be able to use alternate fuel substrate, free fatty acids, amino acids, ketone bodies, etc. And one of the things that I've seen, at least clinically, is when I have patients that are engaging in a fasting protocol that works for them, that we see clinical improvements in all markers of metabolic syndrome. So for those of you that are maybe not familiar with that, it's kind of it's like a constellation of, or you have to have a minimum of 3 of the 5 of the following. So increased blood glucose, ectopic distribution of adiposity, or usually it's like abdominal obesity, let's say, high triglycerides, low high density lipoproteins, and high blood sugar. So when we're fasting regularly, we see improvement in all of those. So we see actually the reverse. So blood glucose comes down, abdominal obesity comes down, the triglyceride level, TGs come down, the high HDLs are going, we're going to increase the high density lipoproteins, and then the blood pressure is also going to come down as well. I mentioned growth hormone with the clotting factors in the liver. We know that growth hormone is known to increase, obviously, availability of fats for fuel. And it's also used to preserve muscle mass and bone density. So for my perimenopausal and menopausal women, this is of utmost importance for you. Generally, growth hormone, like many things, tends to decrease kind of consistently or steadily with age. Exercise, so, and specifically, any type of exercise, but I will state my bias in that resistance training is my exercise of choice. Resistance training is a potent stimulator of growth hormone. We actually see women will sort of reach their peak secretion of growth hormone earlier than our male counterparts. So at about the 20 to 30 minute mark of intense exercise, a woman will see peak levels of growth hormone being released, whereas guys need to work out a little bit longer. We typically see somewhere around the 40 to 60 mark for men with intense exercise, where they're going to see that peak secretion of growth hormone. What we've seen, at least in studies, is with fasting, and particularly long, like multi-day fasts, growth hormone secretion usually doubles. This is for both men and women. So the net physiological effect here is that growth hormone is going to serve to protect muscle, right? So we're going to preserve that active, functional, contractile tissue and bone mass while you're fasting. And of course, if you add a mechanical stimulus like exercising during a fast, you are also going to provide that mechanical stimulus and that mechanical protection to that functional tissue as well. And then the other thing I'll say about fasting in terms of why it's really important, probably not really discussed, but very, I would say, important to me, and at least for some of the women that I counsel, is that it allows for, and I don't have any studies for this yet, but I'll say that this is like a clinical observation, that there's a bit of a dopamine reset from like hyper palatable foods, right? So of course, in modern life, convenience is king, right? So we have Uber Eats and we have, food delivery and all of that. And often, food companies are looking to make sure that you are a repeat customer. So they will formulate their food often with what's kind of known as bliss points. So they will combine sort of high fats with high sugars that kind of keep you coming back for more, because we have this high dopaminergic release when we're consuming these types of bliss point foods. And it's going to increase the, without kind of going down a separate like rabbit hole on brain chemistry, but it will, when you're consuming hyperpalatable foods, the likelihood of you seeking out those foods again is much higher because of the amplitude and the severity, let's say, of the dopamine release based on the type of food that you were eating. So I think that fasting is actually a really great way to sort of have a dopamine, it's like a bit of a dopaminergic reset from some of these hyperpalatable foods. And then of course, augmenting circadian biology like Dr. Diwan was mentioning. And then now there we go. Okay. Insulin resistance. I'm sorry, this looks a little pixelated on my screen. I apologize if it looks like that for you as well. In perimenopause and in menopause, I'll go through the chart in case it's not clear. I would say this is true for men as well, but with the wildly oscillating levels of estrogen, and we'll talk a little bit about how the menstrual cycle contributes to insulin resistance in just a moment, but women become naturally more insulin resistant as we age, okay? And this is also true, we become more anabolically resistant as we age too. So our ability to actually put on, let's say, lean muscle mass also attenuates as we age. And just so we can define insulin resistance, because when I learned it in school, it was like the lock and key, kind of instruction. Insulin resistance is we'll say that the three key insulin response organs are primarily liver, right? Adipose tissue, and muscle, okay? And insulin is going to signal the muscle, the liver, the adipocyte to take up glucose, right? It will also tell the liver, stop with the glucose output. So it's going to inhibit gluconeogenesis. And so an impaired ability to do any of those things, right? So those insulin response organs to take up glucose and the inhibition of like hepatic output of glucose in the presence of insulin is what we call insulin resistance. And again, in Western Europe, in North America, where I live, I'm in Toronto, Canada, this is every other person. Okay, so this is, I saw a stat somewhere that it was 88% of the Western world, the population has some type of metabolic disease, like will fit the category for being metabolically ill and being insulin resistant. And it mostly goes unrecognized. Dr. Diwan said this, mostly goes unrecognized because it is asymptomatic, right? It's not and it's often, like, even clinically, it's not recognized by, you know, the physician who's just doing like if it's just like a fasting blood glucose value. We actually don't have the output of the beta cells from the pancreas. We don't actually know how much insulin is in there to be able to maintain that glucose. So this is where, you know, I've talked to a couple of people who are very into blood glucose regulation and continuous glucose monitors and that sort of thing. And it would just be, you know, if I could wave a magic wand and say, this would be like the ultimate wearable, it would be something that would look at your, you know, postprandial levels of glucose, but also your insulin. Because if your pancreas has to work overtime to get your blood glucose back into a normal range, I would argue also that this is the beginning stages of insulin resistance as well. And so people who are resistant, we'll say insulin resistant, let's say, is because they can't get glucose into glycogen. That's the major pathway. So for many of you on this call, you know, in a healthy individual, 80 to 90% of the glucose, let's say, that we consume is stored as glycogen in the liver, and then of course in the muscle. In a type 2 diabetic, let's say, who's, you know, someone who's, you know, kind of well known as someone who's insulin resistant, there are sort of two processes that have gone awry. And this is also true for that perimenopausal or menopausal woman. The first is that the liver is not going to stop that gluconeogenesis process, right? So it's going to continue to produce glucose. And the second is that less glucose is being taken up by the muscle. So overall, the production is up and clearance is down, right? Which is just bad news bears. And so when we're kind of getting to, you know, specifically for females and fasting, I've mentioned this a couple of times at this point. Obviously, the big sexual difference is going to be that reproductive cycle, that ever-changing hormonal milieu from week to week over several decades. And in that cycle, of course, we cycle through periods of high estrogen and low estrogen, high testosterone and low testosterone, high progesterone and low progesterone. And even, you know, just as a point of interest, even in the menstrual cycle for a woman in her reproductive years, we know that progesterone decreases the phosphorylation of glucose into glucose 6-phosphate, right? Which is kind of imperative to start off the Krebs cycle. And so we actually need to, even for a woman who is menstruating, we need to be aware of some of the alterations, let's say, how she might fast differently through her menstrual cycle, when are periods where she's more or less insulin sensitive. And as a general rule, if you're a clinician or a doctor watching who sees patients, generally she's more insulin sensitive in the follicular phase, so bleed week and prior to ovulation, than she is in the luteal phase of her cycle, so like post-ovulatory up until her bleed week. When we are fasting, so the other thing I'll mention with the reproductive cycle is when a woman is aggressively fasting, so she's fasting too aggressively too often, she can kind of go through, we'll say, that her fertility in general downregulates, where we actually see the opposite in men. So men get more fertile with fasting, females get less fertile with excessive fasting, we'll say. And from a teleologic perspective, from an evolutionary lens, of course, that does make sense, like carrying a pregnancy in a famine, which is essentially what what prolonged fasting can be perceived as on a cellular level is much, much harder. You know, kind of without, I find myself wanting to get pulled into like telling you all these little facts. So I'll tell you one thing. So for example, in the ovary, when we look at density of mitochondria per oocyte, we have 100,000 mitochondria per oocyte. Now, if you compare that to a liver cell, there's about 2,000 mitochondria per hepatocyte. When we look at the heart, there's about 5,000 mitochondria per myocyte. So as a woman, as a menstruating woman, your ovaries are kind of like the eyes in your body, right? That are constantly scanning the environment. So if you do not have enough food, your ovaries are going to be like, you know what, maybe we're going to skip the opportunity for this woman to get pregnant this month because there's no food. And so it will absolutely directly affect fertility. The other thing I'll mention is DHEA. This is actually a study that came out earlier this month in obesity, so October 22. They followed a group of pre and post menopausal women. They were all classified as obese. The study length was 8 weeks in length, and they followed the warrior diet method of intermittent fasting. So the warrior diet is basically a TRE, or time restricted feeding window, of about 4 hours a day. And so dieters, or like the participants, let's say in the study, were able to eat without counting calories, but only in that time restricted feeding window before kind of resuming a water fast that would start after that 4 hour time period. And what they noted was there was a significant drop in DHEA. So this is a hormone, this is like I always call this the mother hormone. Like DHEA gives rise to progesterone and estrogen and testosterone. It's the mother. If you've ever been to a fertility clinic, they will give you DHEA to improve ovarian function and egg quality for extraction later on. But it was significantly lower in both premenopausal and postmenopausal women by the end of the 8-week trial, and it was dropping by about 14% across both groups. Now, even though the researchers noted that in that 8-week study, that 14% drop was like the levels of their DHEA were still within normal range, I would argue that, and I can say this because I've seen thousands of females at this point, they don't just fast for 8 weeks. There's like women are fasting for months and decades because they are just so desperately trying to lose the weight. So we do see with aggressive fasting, let's say, we do see some of these changes in our female hormones that are specifically related to our fertility. I mentioned insulin resistance as well. And then of course, I will say also the stress response. So women, the stress response to fasting or prolonged fasting is heightened in women. So they will, when you have a woman who is, let's say, doing a more than a 24-hour fast, often she will begin to report sleep disturbances. So she'll be thinking about food a lot more. Heightened learning actually is kind of an interesting, this was noted in rodents, it kind of makes sense, right? They're trying to figure out if they're put in a maze, they're able to figure out the maze quicker because they're trying to figure out where the food is, right? And then women in general, depending on how much time we have, I might go into leptin or not, but we hit that hunger point earlier than we do, than our male counterparts do, which is to say that we tend to be more leptin resistant at any given BMI than our male counterparts do. Okay, so let me just jump into kind of like the different types of fasts, and then you can tell me how I'm doing on time and how much more of how much of a nerd safari I can continue to go on with you. But there's a couple of different types of like intermittent fasting in general. Again, very general term. I do like to think of fasting as manipulating 3 levers. So we can manipulate the type of fast, what kind of fast, and you'll see that I really like to do this with different types of hormonal compositions. The duration of the fast. So is it a 12-hour fast? Is it a 16-hour fast? Is it a 36-hour fast, et cetera? And then the frequency of the fast. So how often are you engaging in this particular strategy for trying to correct whatever metabolic or hormonal, let's say, a problem that you're trying to correct. And each lever, of course, can be manipulated and combined together, right, to achieve some type of desired outcome. So the first type is what I call a non-caloric liquid fast. This is what the fasting Puritans or fasting purists might agree with me is the only type of fast. This is like water, herbal tea, black coffee, of course. So these are very low calorie, right? We know water, no calories, herbal tea, you know, maybe 2 calories. You know, coffee has like 4 calories per cup. This is the most useful intervention for women with PCOS. So this is the type of fast that I will administer the most with my ladies who have polycystic ovary syndrome. It is one of the most powerful ways to reduce the hyperinsulinemic, we'll say, state that many women with PCOS struggle with. And so with this type of fasting, of course, these nutrient sensing pathways, Dr. Diwan mentioned mTOR, all of these, insulin levels are going to fall. So over time, that's going to help improve the insulin sensitivity at the level of the cell. Another type of fast that I will often recommend is a caloric liquid fast. So there's some calories, let's say, but it's still in liquid form. This is for my ladies who will often complain of like a primary complaint of like premenstrual syndrome or estrogen dominance, which is to say that estrogen is going unopposed in the luteal phase of her cycle. It is a bit like the word estrogen. I'm a bit of a word freak. So estrogen, we need estrogen to be dominant at certain parts of the cycle, like in the follicular phase, we need a huge estrogen surge in order to develop that primary follicle. But in the luteal phase of the cycle, we definitely want progesterone to be the main hormone. So we want progesterone secretion to be higher than estrogen. And then, of course, we know that progesterone actually downregulates the estrogen receptor and inhibits estrogen release. But when estrogen is going unopposed, often we will see symptoms like breast tenderness and moodiness and sleep disturbances. And then, in its extreme, we see vaginal dryness and painful sex, etc. So like this kind of caloric liquid fast would be like bone broth. You can also have, some vegetables and things in it. It has collagen, which will help to repair the epithelial lining of the gut. It helps to reduce gut issues, which a lot of women with estrogen dominance have. There's like disruption in the estrobolome, which is kind of a subset, let's say, of the microbiome that's involved in getting rid of estrogen. And so if we have derangement, if we have high levels of an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, let's say, we are going to take conjugated estrogens and then we're going to deconjugate them essentially and bring them back into circulation. So I really like to give a woman with that type of clinical presentation, let's say, some type of bone broth or soup fasting. So it's kind of more of a model of caloric restriction, where she's still taking in some calories, she's still getting in some proteins, let's say, but it's going to help with liver detoxification and specifically with gut health as well. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on PCOS for a moment, if I have time. Dennis, am I okay for time? If I may. I can also take questions if you'd like.
Yes, I think you can go on for another minute or two, Stephanie, and then we should switch to questions. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
All right. So let's talk about PCOS, because this is going to be, as a clinician, this is going to be the most common hormonal derangement that you will see in women. 100 million women worldwide are dealing with this. So it's actually interesting where we see, there's been a lot of talk around the declining levels of testosterone in men. So we're seeing sort of this estrogenization, let's say, of our beautiful men. And with our women, we're seeing a testosteronization, if that's a word. But clinically, when we're looking at PCOS, we are seeing a clinically high, we're seeing a high ratio of luteinizing hormone to follicular stimulating hormone. And of course, we know that your period for a woman, your menstrual cycle starts in your brain. And so normally, when you measure, when you're looking at the LH to FSH ratio, that should be measured on day 2 or day 3 of a woman's menstrual cycle. A normal ratio is about a 1-to-1. So you should have about a 1-to-1 ratio of luteinizing to follicular stimulating hormone. With women with PCOS, this is going to be absolutely disruptive. So we're going to see luteinizing hormone levels rising like 2x, 3x levels of follicular stimulating hormone. And of course, that is going to affect that luteinizing hormone surge in the follicular phase, which is going to help with that release of the primary egg from the follicle. And this is usually because insulin levels are too high, right? It could also be that there's like hyperprolactinemia, which we won't get into, but that basically means that the levels of prolactin are too high, that are causing an increase as well in luteinizing hormone secretion. So so basically what's happening with a woman with PCOS is her body is acting more male, right? So we are going to see weight gain through the abdomen, that kind of spare tire, let's say, presentation. The more proper term for that would be like an ectopic fat distribution, right? So she's increasing that abdominal adiposity. We might see hair growth on the face. We might see even like those, and it's usually like kind of along the chin or the jawline where it's like very thick black hair. Even on her chest, on her back, she might experience hair loss, similar to men. And of course, there's some genetic components that I'm not getting into, but often in PCOS, we actually see an upregulation of genes like SRD5A2 or 5-alpha reductase usually is also increased there as well. So one of the best things that I like to do with these women is I like to give them that non-caloric liquid fast, so like the water, the herbal tea, and she can actually fast aggressively in her bleed week. So if she does actually have a bleed week, or where we can approximate, let's say, where her week 1 might be. And if we don't know if she hasn't ovulated in months, then we're just going to start where we're going to start. But we can build up her fasting tolerance such that we are giving her long water fasts to help with that insulin sensitivity. So we're going to see that insulin drop right after we're fasting, after 12 or 24 hours. We know that we see that kind of insulin drop, and then that will affect, if we do that over the course of time, that's going to improve her insulin sensitivity. And then of course, hopefully the goal is, because PCOS prevents the ovarian follicles from reaching ovulation, which either causes delay or not a release in a follicle as well. Of course, the goal is to get her to ovulate. And that's, for a lot of women, or I think doctors make the same mistake too. We all focus on the period. We all focus on the bleed week. Like that's the more salient event, let's say, in a woman's menstrual cycle. The actual point of a woman's menstrual cycle is to ovulate. And so that should be the primary goal for you using fasting as a tool in this population. So, okay, so I think I'll stop there. I have, as I mentioned before we started, I super over prepared for this. So I have other, topics of consideration for estrogen dominance, leptin resistance, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, etc. But why don't I stop here, and then I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much indeed,
Yes.
Stephanie. First of all, I'm going to take one or two of the questions sent in by some of our attendees.
Sure.
Natalie Needham has asked, fasting for postmenopausal women, a question here, given that their disease risk skyrockets after loss of menses. How would you deal with that question?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm really glad that you asked it, because a lot of menopausal women get lost in the shuffle, right? Like, we often are like, this is what happens for a woman in her reproductive years, and then all the perimenopausal women and the menopausal women are like, okay, great, and I'm 55, so can you please give me some strategies that are going to work for me? So one of the beautiful things about I'll say menopause is that we're not any longer trying to optimize for our fertility, right? So your menstrual cycle in your reproductive years is absolutely a vital sign. Now, when you are in your menopausal years, you're kind of free from those shackles, so to speak. And because we have lower level, we don't cycle the same way that we do through testosterone being high and low, estrogen high and low, progesterone, et cetera, being high and low. So I would say that for a menopausal woman, in many ways, and this is not meant to be derogatory, it's something to celebrate, because we're not optimizing for our fertility anymore. In many ways, we behave more male. So in the same way that I was, mentioning that men have this like beautiful, like men are like the sun, women are like the moon, like men sort of have this like kind of steady state, same kind of, we're the same sort of cycling through day in, day out. Menopausal women begin to approximate that. So I would say that you can find a fasting regimen that works for you over the long term. And I typically like to at least fast somewhere between 12, let's say, to 14 hours daily. So that might be something that you work yourself up to, of course, being, most of that being overnight, hopefully like 8-9 hours, let's say, overnight. And then you can do that day in, day out, because you're not now cycling through these different vacillations of these sex hormones. So you can do the same thing every day. The other thing I will add in, and again, I'll state my bias where it is, but I think that it is so important. When we think about all the benefits that fasting confers, like the autophagy, the reduction in inflammatory pathways, removing senescent cells, all of those things are also important to pair with resistance training, because we get, as we age, perimenopausal and menopausal women, we begin to lose lean muscle mass if we are not actively engaging in stimulating the neuromusculoskeletal system. And women in particular, we want to be concerned with sarcopenia. Dr. Diwan brought that up in his presentation, which is basically the fatty infiltration into muscle. And of course, where muscles go, so goes the bones, right? So we also want to be thinking about dense, thick bones as we are aging, because the other thing that we don't want, along with sarcopenia, is osteopenia, which is a weakening of the cortical bone. There's, and the cancellous, but basically the bones become a bit more brittle, so that if you do have a fall, let's say, I saw this a lot in clinic, we call these foosh injuries, of FOOSH, fall on outstretched hand. We would see fractures of the scaphoid in the wrist, the radius, the ulna, etc., or even more diabolical, really, is a fracture of the hip. And if you fracture the hip because the hip has been brittle and that takes you out, it is really difficult to come back from that. Of course, we not only physically are you kind of down for the count for several months, but we also know that there's a cognitive decline that's associated with that. So long, all that to say, I would say for a menopausal woman, find a fasting regimen that works, right? You can do the non-caloric liquid fast, and maybe you want to do 12-12, let's say, 12 hours of feeding, 12 hours of fasting. And if that works for your daily life, you can just do that on repeat forever. And I know that maybe you wanted a bit more specific answer, but I will say that the best, and Dr. Diwan actually said this as well, the best diet and the best fasting regimen is the thing that you can do over a longer delta, over a long period of time. Anybody can do a 24-hour fast one time, 2 times, maybe you can do it for several months, but at some point it's going to be such a, you're going to have to drive up so much dopamine, so much momentum, so much motivation in order to continue that habit. So we want to make it easy enough for you to be able to adapt it to the many different permutations of your life.
Now, a variation on that question from Zoriana Benhamo: what about fasting for a peri and postmenopausal woman who is athletic? Are there any risks?
Yeah, good question. So if you're athletic, my assumption, of course, is that you are lifting weights and maybe there's some cardiovascular component to it. I actually do detail this a lot in my book, but I will say that I don't like a lot of aggressive fasting. So perimenopausal woman, still in your reproductive years. Okay. So I know that you're in that sort of transition zone going into menopause, but you are still trying to optimize for your fertility. Even if the shop is closed, even if there's no more babies in your future, as a vital sign, we want to be optimizing for these hormones. So I would say that for an athletic woman, you can fast in, again, a gentle way that's easy for you to do all through the cycle. My bias is around that second week. So in that second week of our menstrual cycle, we see estrogen rise, we see testosterone rise. And this is the time when I mentioned those oocytes are kind of saying, okay, like it's go time. We are going to release the egg, right? Everything is okay here. So this is a time where I actually like very gentle, if at all, fasting is in that second week of your cycle, let's say the week before you ovulate. If you're fasting too aggressively, as I mentioned before, from that sort of evolutionary perspective, there may be, let's say, a cellular decision that's made that there's not enough substrate in order to get pregnant, and that pregnancy might be, let's say, or the capacity to become pregnant might be shut down, and you might skip, if you're aggressively fasting, you might skip ovulation. So I actually like in that second week of a woman's menstrual cycle for there to be a very gentle, like 12-12 maybe, if at all, fast. And then you can kind of jump back into it, let's say post-ovulation, if you're used to doing a 16-8 or a 14-10 or something like that, you can kind of jump back into your regular schedule of fasting.
Thank you very much. And there's also a question that Professor Diwan left on the Q&A before he had to leave. He asks, is autophagy always beneficial? What variables do we need to understand to harness its benefits? Time of day, activation of autophagy, physiologic stimuli, drugs. Anyway, the general question is it always beneficial?
I think that he might have even touched on this before he left. I think that everything exists on a spectrum. So I think that absolutely cellular turnover and cellular cleaning up is very important. But again, taken to an extreme, if you like his slide, I believe there was like a round circle, and then on the right hand was all of the green things that autophagy can help with, and then there was like necrosis in sort of the red. So of course, taken to the extreme, autophagy can be fatal. So I think that autophagy is beneficial. There's always some baseline level of autophagy happening anyway, and then we can augment it. For example, one of the ways I love to, fasting is one, a very obvious way that we can augment autophagy. So is training. So is resistance training, because you're actually turning over muscle cells, right? You're actually creating stronger and better sarcomeres and the fibrils, etc. So I would say that it exists on a continuum. In terms of fasting specifically, one of the things that I like to do that I have found actually increases my heart rate variability overnight and increases my quality of sleep is fasting with a night limiter, meaning that I have my last meal, call it 2 to 3 hours before my stated bedtime is. So I typically go to bed somewhere around like 9:30 or 10. So I usually am not eating past 7. And that sort of allows for that for me to be in that post-absorptive phase overnight. So like my stomach is fully emptied, I'm not lying down in bed with like a full stomach, where then we kind of run into other like clinical presentations, like, having some of the acid and so forth kind of knock back into the esophagus. But I would say it is beneficial up until a point. And I think understanding how we can augment it specifically overnight, I think is really important. With exercise, I also think is another important way to do it. And I would say overnight, you know, in a fasted state is a great time for us to be thinking about improving our capacity for autophagy. And then you know, depending on how you fuel your workouts, like you may consider, you know, working out fasted as well. Like, you know, that's kind of combining two of the sort of big heavy hitters together, is like exercise and fasting as well.
Finally, we've got about just a couple of minutes left before the end of the webinar. I've got a cultural question in a sense.
Sure.
It's obvious that fasting has been a tradition in many cultures around the world, religious and otherwise. Do you think that people in those far off times when those traditions developed understood the health benefits, or do you think those were merely cultural? Maybe the question is badly phrased anyway. What's the difference between knowing what does you good and what is cultural?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful question, and it's an insightful one. I think that often fasting, at least historically, came from like evolutionary pressure. There wasn't a Starbucks down the road or Uber Eats on your phone. You know, like I think if we traveled back like 1,000 years and showed everyone our iPhones, like, you know, I think there would be just some really confused faces with our foremothers and forefathers. So I think that there was evolutionary pressure there. I think from a religious standpoint, it's hard to know whether or not they were aware of it. I can say just being around some European cultures, at least that fast, let's say for Lent, that they always feel like I've you know, spoken to you know, my mother-in-law, who would just always feel so good. She would always say, I feel so clean. You know, I feel so clean when I don't have, like with Lent specifically, it's like there's no meat and there's like a whole laundry list of things that they don't eat for 40 days. And she would always say, I feel so clean. I feel like I can think better. I have more energy. My joints feel better. So I'm sure that there's some subjective understanding of the benefits of fasting. And of course, there's like spiritual fasting as well. Like they're cleaning themselves for the, you know, for the, at least in the Christian sort of faith, you know, around the birth and death, let's say, of Christ. So I think that there's certainly subjective evidence that people felt better fasting. But it's hard to say, but it is a good question. I don't think I have exactly the answer though.
Well, maybe that's we need some humanities people to come in and
yeah, I think so.
Those questions, don't we? Anyway, I'm going to bring the webinar to an end now. So a great thanks to our two speakers, obviously, Professor Abhinav Diwan and Stephanie Estima. And great thanks also to the organizers of the Oxford Longevity Project. I've put a lot of effort into all of this. And of course, a great thanks to our audience and to our future audience, because of course, these are all recorded and you can access all of the past webinars of the Oxford Longevity Project on the Oxford Longevity website. And with that, thanks to everybody. I hope I've thanked everybody. We bring the webinar to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.